you for the cross, Lord. Thank you for the price you paid, bearing all my sin and shame. In love you came and gave amazing grace. Thank you for this love, Lord. Thank you for the nail-pierced hands. Wash me in your cleansing flow. Now all I know, your forgiveness and embrace. Worthy is the Lamb, seated on the throne. Crown you now with many crowns. You reign victorious. I am lifted up, Jesus, Son of God, the darling of heaven, crucified. Worthy is the Lamb. Worthy is the Lamb. Thank you for the cross, Lord. Thank you for the price you paid, bearing all my sin and shame. In love you came and gave amazing grace. Thank you for this love, Lord. Thank you for the nail-pierced hands. Wash me in your cleansing flow. Now all I know, your forgiveness and embrace. Worthy is the Lamb, seated on the throne. Crown you now with many crowns. You reign victorious. I am lifted up, Jesus, Son of God, the darling of heaven, crucified. Worthy is the Lamb. Worthy is the Lamb. Worthy is the Lamb. Worthy is the Lamb. Who has held the oceans in his hands? Who has numbered every grain of sand? Kings and nations tremble at his voice. All creation rises to rejoice. Behold, our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore
Well, good evening. Thank you for being part of this event tonight. My name's Peter Burney. I'm the minister at Riverside Church. And this is a follow-up event from one we had 2 weeks ago when we were kind of wrestling with COVID-19 and the God who is in control. Could it be part of God's plan? And we didn't try to be too ambitious last time. We didn't try to be so presumptuous as to explain God to people. How could that be possible, that we could explain one who is so far above us? But we did try to describe who God is. We recognize that if God is who the Bible says he is, then he's like a lion who can defend himself. And so we can describe him to people, and we can talk about the things that he's revealed himself, and then we can let people try to respond properly. And the last time we talked about how the Bible revealed, and then how Jesus proved, when he was on this earth, who God is. God is all powerful. He's not like a nice middle manager who would help us if he can, but it's out of his hands. No, he's all powerful. He's not a corrupt policeman either, is what we said. Looking one way for some people and then coming down hard on others. No, we said the Bible reveals that God is holy. That is, he hates what is wrong. He is just, so he only does what is right. And the sort of difficult conclusion we came to from those three truths, if God is all powerful, if that's what the Bible says about him, if that's what Jesus reveals, if he is holy and if he is just, well, then the kind of difficult conclusion was that, well, the mess that we're in must be what we deserve. But there was a fourth truth about God as well, and this was a wonderful truth, that God is a God of love. And that's how Christians would describe God in one word if they had to. If they were pushed to try to describe in one word, they would say God is love. And that was a love that is proved when Jesus went to the cross, proved by the empty tomb. And so the important conclusion we came to last time was really, we don't need to understand everything about God. We don't need to understand everything about his actions, but actually we need to respond to him properly. We need to come to Jesus Christ and treat him as our King. And in Riverside Church, that's what we want for those of us who come on Sundays, but that's what we want for our community around us too. We want them to respond properly to God, to come to Jesus and treat him as King. But the response to that from people who did respond from the last time, it kind of can be summed up like this. Look, does that actually work? Is the Christian gospel, that's what we call this, is the Christian gospel coherent? Is it relevant? Does it actually make sense as we look at the world around us? And so to go some way towards answering that, it is a real pleasure and a delight to be able to welcome Melvin Tinker tonight. Melvin has been the vicar of St. John, Newland for 26 years now. He's written many books. He's thought deeply on these things. And so it is brilliant to have him with us tonight. And Melvin's going to talk for about 20 minutes. And then after that, I'll get a chance to ask him some questions, but you too can get a chance to ask him some questions as well. If you use the different methods that Tim put up on the screen, you can email me, or you can respond on the YouTube or Facebook or whatever, and those questions will come to me, and we'll get a chance to ask Melvin those questions. So let's pass over to Melvin now. Thank you very much for being here, and over to you, Melvin.
Great. Well, it's good to be with you tonight. I can only see one or two people, but that doesn't matter. You can see me. That's the important thing, isn't it, tonight? Okay, well, let me begin perhaps with a little bit of a sort of my own sort of personal story. I mean, sometimes people think like vicars and ministers are sort of just float down from heaven. We're already made. That's not so. I mean, my background is that I come from a mining family in Nottinghamshire, and the person who particularly influenced me was my granddad. And I didn't know the term then, but he would have been an atheist. He didn't believe in God. And that certainly shaped most of my thinking throughout my childhood and into teenage years. And so for me, for my family, really, Christianity was churchianity. You only went to church for christenings for weddings and funerals, or weddings, christenings and funerals, whichever order it actually came in. And so for me, the picture I had of the church, particularly in Christianity, was that it was rather boring. And when I studied RE at school, that didn't really improve my impression either. Again, it was a fairly sort of dull subject in my view. But when I finished my A-levels when I was 16, nothing much to do. I went to visit a friend of mine in the next town, and just to kick a ball around and so on. And then I met his family, who were very kind to me and courteous and thoughtful. And I used to go there quite regularly after that, usually on a Friday night, and I used to play chess with my friend, and they invited me on for supper and so on. And then I discovered they were Christians. They went to chapel, and they say went to chapel, and I think they were the first, to my knowledge anyway, first Christians I'd met. Perhaps I had met some others, but they were clearly Christians. They said so. And I was you won't believe this, but I was a fairly argumentative young man. You know, I really was. And so I used to sort of argue the toss with them about Christianity. And of course, at 16, 17, you know everything. But anyway, to cut a long story short, over a period of time, well, first of all, let me say that my aim in life at that point was to turn my friend away from the Christian faith, because I thought no intelligent person could be a Christian. It was like fairy stories. But over a period of time, two things struck me. First of all, I thought to myself, well, I really soon discovered that I didn't know that much about the Christian faith. I thought I did, but I didn't. And that came out as I was discussing things with them. So I thought, well, if I'm going to do a really good demolition job, I need to find out a little bit more for myself. So I started to read the New Testament. I thought that's a good place to start. Started with Matthew's Gospel to tell me about Jesus. And as I read this, I thought, whoa, he's not quite who I thought he was, a good moral teacher. He's something else. And I couldn't quite get some explanations to who he was. And as I was reading that, together with talking to my friend and his family, I got this sort of growing inner conviction. There was something about this that was attractive, that seemed to have, I don't know, it just sort of hung together. It had weight to it, and it was sort of beginning to feel, it was compelling, you know. And the second thing that struck me was, well, with this family, it wasn't just church going. They knew, the only way I could put it is that they knew God, I didn't. It was a personal relationship they clearly had with him. They spoke of God as if he was a person they knew, they spoke to. He spoke to them through the Bible. And those two came together and made a massive impact on me. And after sort of struggling, resisting, thinking I know best, I came to the point where I thought, no, it seems to me that it's not simply that Christianity works. Christianity is true. Now, if it's true, then of course it will work. And I saw that it worked in the lives of these people, that it gave them a sense of purpose, it gave them a sense of significance. And they had reasons for what they did and how they viewed the world, which I didn't. And of course, I was only 17. And then one particular point, I can remember one evening, I was reading a book by the American evangelist Billy Graham. Can't remember exactly what he said, but it was to the effect that being a Christian isn't just having head knowledge, believing about God, it's knowing God. And we know God by the fact that he's come to us in the person of Jesus Christ, that he died for us on the cross to put us right with God, and he's alive again. He invites you to surrender your life to him, and that's what I did. Now, there wasn't no sort of flashing lights or anything like that, or Cliff Richard singing in the background, you know. But that was the point I look back and say, that is when my life changed. And had you said then that I was going to end up as a vicar, you might as well have said you were going to be an astronaut. Nothing could have been further than the truth. So it was compelling. So it made sense intellectually. And as I've gone on 40 odd years later, it's become even more compelling intellectually. but also is backed up by changed lives. So it wasn't just an abstract thing. I saw it lived out, and that made a big, big impact on me. So whether it's a religion or a philosophy or or if you call it a worldview, it doesn't matter. The fact is, every single person holds certain beliefs. And these beliefs are really meant to help us understand the world, why it is as it is, and our place in that world, to help us live meaningful lives. And there are four big questions any religion or philosophy tries to answer. And the big four are these. One, where do I come from? The question of origin. Two, why am I here? The question of significance. Three, why is the world in a mess? The question of evil. And four, is there a future? That is the question of purpose. Now, it's been said that contrast is the mother of clarity. That is, by contrasting different views or different religions, we can get a clear grasp on which is the most reasonable and the most sensible. And we might think of religion or philosophy, if you like, as a sort of map which helps us to negotiate our way through life and, again, to make sense of things. And I got a great map here, Kingston upon Hull, our trusty map. We've had this 26 years and it's changed a bit. It's changed a bit, but there we are. Still good. Now, the thing is, any map worth its salt, of course, has got to correspond with what you see around you. And if there are things on the map which aren't there in front of you, well, it's a pretty lousy map. And if there are things in front of you which aren't on the map, then again, it's a lousy map. So, you know, if you go to Skirler and I look at the map and according to this, there's a gigantic reservoir in the middle of Skirler, that is a rubbishy map. I don't know what the guy was on when he did that, if he's produced that. Or if there's a lovely church building in front of you in Skirler and that's not on the map, then again, it's a pretty useless map. Now, I have found, and I've looked at other religions, but I found that the Christian faith is the most reliable map around because it answers those four big questions more satisfactorily than anything else, than any other religion or any view. So let's take them and throughout I'll contrast them with some other views, again, just to show you how different Christianity is. So the first question, the big one, is where do I come from? The question of origins. And you've got to be careful when you ask that question because there's a story of a little boy who came home from school one day and said, Dad, where do I come from? And of course, that was the question, you know, Pete would, you know, his gills asked that question one day. And of course, he said, this is it. So he goes through all the facts of life, terribly embarrassed, turning beetroot red. And the boy's sitting there mesmerized and can't believe what his dad's telling him. And he said, well, I just wondered, Dad, it's just that Ben from next door came from Birmingham and I want to know where I came from. So you got to be careful on that one. So a question of origins. Well, the secularist or the atheist or the humanist tells us that we come from nothing. I mean, and when I say nothing, I mean nothing. There was no time, there was no matter, there was nothing. And so somehow out of nothing came something. Now that, I don't know, is not a very good suggestion as far as I'm concerned. And they say we're just all a product of chance and matter and time, and here we are. But to me, that doesn't explain anything, and it doesn't explain origins at all well. And particularly, how do you get personal beings like ours with a sense of purpose and significance from that which is impersonal? It makes more sense, and this is what the Bible tells us, that actually there is a personal, infinite God who is the creator. And he's the creator of all things. And he's created things to have meaning and purpose. And all created things have purpose. So here I've got a pencil, and whoever made this pencil made it with a particular purpose in mind, namely that it's a writing implement. Now, of course, I could be a total loony and decide to use this pencil for some other things, you know, cleaning out wax in your ear hole, or using it to lever off a lid from a jar or whatever it may be. But that's an abuse of the pencil. That's not what it was made for. It was made for writing. Now, in some ways, as human beings, we can abuse ourselves. We think all we're made for is just to eat, drink, and be merry. But that's like using a pencil for what it's not really made for. But the Bible tells us, no, actually, we're made by a personal God, a loving God, and we are like him in so many ways. We ourselves are rational. We reason things out. We're moral. We have a sense of right and wrong. And we are relational. We're relational beings. And most of us find our greatest satisfaction and greatest sense of significance when we're relating to people, whether it's as a family or friends meeting together again. That's when time seems to, I don't know, just take on a different quality altogether. Now, the Bible explains why that is so. If there is a personal God who's made everything and has made me personally as well. So where do I come from? The question of origins. Then follows on is the question of who am I? The question of significance. If I'm just a product of pure chance, like spilt milk, then like spilt milk, I've got no significance. Spilt milk is just spilt milk. It's there. It's an accident. So can we really believe deep down that's all we are, accidents, on the same level as milk that's just been spilt on the floor? But again, the Bible tells us something radically different to that, and which deep down we know to be so, that in fact we do feel significant. And the reason we feel significant is because we are made by a loving creator. And in many ways, we do get our identity, who we are, from relationships with others. So I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a grandfather, and so on. And so I am Arnold Tinker's son. He made me in one sense, and he loved me, and he taught me, and he cared for me. And so I get part of my significance, a fair degree of my significance, about my relationship with my dad. And in a bigger and deeper way, it's the case with all of us in relation to God. Because as a Christian, I know now that I'm a child of God. He is my loving Father. He loves me. And actually, I'm made to love him. And that gives me a great sense of worth. And again, we know this in our human relationships. To be married to Heather, that gives me a sense of worth. Having children, a sense of worth, and so on. So it is. Who am I? Made by God, a personal God. But then you've got the dark side of life, and that is, why is the world in such a mess? The question of evil. Now, for the humanist or the atheist, in one sense, there's no such thing as evil. There may be things which are unpleasant, but evil in terms of something that should not be, or having a twisted moral nature, doesn't figure if everything's just come from pure chance and is meaningless. In the words of Richard Dawkins, what we call evil is, quote, just damn bad luck. Tough. You don't even have to deal with the problem of evil. There is no problem. For Eastern religions like Buddhism and Hinduism, for example, and the sect Christian Science, evil doesn't exist, or suffering doesn't exist. They say it's illusion. It belongs to the world of Maya, illusion. But most people would say no, there is evil. You know, you'd have to be what a rubbishy map that denies evil. It's like, you know, denying that Kingston upon Hull is on the River Hull. You know, it's ridiculous. But the Bible tells us there is evil and there is suffering, and they're very, very real. And that if you want to try and understand it to some degree, it is a corruption of the good. You've got to have good in order for there to be evil. You can't have evil without good. So what makes a bad apple? Well, a bad apple is a good apple that's gone bad. It's either bruised or it's got fungus. It's corrupted. And so the Bible tells us that we live in a good creation that has gone bad. It's corrupted. And that's due to our own human rebellion, going back to our forefathers, but we're all part of it. We all contribute to the badness, the dis-ease in the world. And of course, that needs to be put right. Can it be put right? And that brings us on to the final big question: is there a future? And that's the question of purpose individually and purpose for the world. Now, again, for the humanist, atheist, there is no future. Personally, there's no real future because we all die and we become worm food. For the universe, there's no future. There was a big bang, there's going to be a big crunch, and it's all going to disappear one day. And some believe, well, there's been lots of big bangs and lots of big crunches, but it just keeps happening over and over and over again. And how boring and useless is that? For the Buddhist, again, there's no future. For an individual, there's only what's called nirvana. And don't think that's a state of happiness and bliss. Nirvana is a state of nothingness. They use the illustration of salt being sprinkled into water. It just dissolves and is gone. So there's no continuation after death. There's nothing. So there's no future. But Christianity, very, very different altogether, because there is real hope. And that is because of God's rescue plan. The God who's made us, the God who's given us significance, actually takes evil and suffering in the world seriously, so much so that he himself, in the person of Jesus Christ, came into this world 2,000 years ago to live as one of us. And so if you want to know what God is really like, or who God is really like, you look to Jesus, for he displays perfectly the full character of God. Did he hate injustice? Of course he did. Did he, was he offended by suffering? Of course he was. And he took steps to deal with all of those things. But then he deals with a big, big problem, which is our ultimate rebellion against God and our severance from God because of that. And that's what the cross is all about. Now, when I was trying to wrestle with Christianity, that was the thing that I found very difficult to understand. What was good about Good Friday? It looked pretty bad to me, until it was explained to me that this was God's means of putting things right, that all the wrong stuff in the world that has ever been and ever will be was put into Jesus, as it were, like a vessel. And he took the rap for all that we've done wrong, willingly, wonderfully, and dealt with it, finished with it, took the punishment we deserve. And so God's justice is satisfied once and for all. But also in that, we see the greatest expression of love for what we deserve, which is exemplified by the cross, which is judgment. He took in our place, and that is real, real love. But of course, it didn't end there, because he rose again from the dead. It was the bodily resurrection. And that, in history, again, shows us where the material world matters. You know, it wasn't just a spiritual resurrection, because the body matters, the creation matters to God. And that's a pointer of what will happen at the end of time. Both for all those who trust in Christ, there will be a bodily resurrection, as the Bible calls it, in order to inhabit a totally new creation when Christ comes again. And so that is when all those four questions are totally and completely answered. But it's not just pure future, because it's a matter of knowing God now and have our lives transformed now by becoming a Christian. So I'd just like to say this, that I think I've nearly got me 20 minutes up, but the Christian faith is coherent. It hangs together in a way that atheism doesn't and Buddhism doesn't. It's consistent. It's not full of contradictions. Now, there may be some things which are difficult to fathom. That's a different thing altogether. But you don't get something like, well, black is white, you know, or up is down, you know, anything like that. And it's also comprehensive, like a good map. It actually covers all the big things in life, those 4 big questions. It doesn't ignore the difficult bits. It faces them head on. So it's coherent, it's consistent, it's comprehensive. But the other big thing is that it's compelling. It really works. And there's a verse in the Bible, Psalm 34, which says, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." And that's an important verse, really, because when you think about it, I mean, I could, for example, describe to you, if I brought it along, a cube of sugar. And I could say, well, the sugar's hard, it's granular, it dissolves in tea, it's sweet. I could even give you the chemical formula for sugar, but I'm not going to show off. But the thing is, for you to know that it is sweet, I could testify to it. I could bring you loads of other people say, sugar's sweet. The only way you can know at the end of the day is if you taste it yourself. And that's what it is to become a Christian eventually. You know, you can look at all the arguments, you can compare it with other religions and everything else, and it will stand out second to none. And the other thing about Christianity is that it's not confined to a certain group of people. So it's not like some philosophers, which are ever so complicated, so only clever people can understand them. It's not just restricted to certain cultures. The thing is, with Christianity, the cleverest people in the world have become Christians. The simplest people, a child can become a Christian. You be Africans, Indians, even Australians, you know, have become Christians. It is universal, which again tells me something about its, I don't know, its truthfulness. It works wherever you are in the world. It works. It's compelling. But let me just finish with saying this, that although I talked about Christianity being like a map, and that's not a bad illustration, it falls short a little bit because it's much more like having a personal guide. The Bible says about Jesus that he is the author and the pioneer of our faith. And the idea there is that he's like a trailblazer, like in those American John Wayne films, Westerns I used to like, you know, where you get the scout who will go on ahead, you know, to pioneer through Indian country and the desert, everything else, to the place where you want to settle, at the settlements. He then comes back and he gets the settlers and he leads the wagon train through with them to the destination. And then it's Little House on the Prairie. And Jesus is like that. He's the one who's been through this world. God has come as the person, in the person of Jesus Christ. He's been through the world with all its ups and downs, with all its heartache, with all its joys, the heights and depths of human living, even to the point of suffering the most agonizing death possible. He's come through it. And he comes back again in 2 ways. One, he comes back into our lives when we ask him by his Spirit, so that he can then be with us and guide us through this life to the next. And secondly, he's going to come back bodily at the end of time to wind up history and to right all wrongs. So there you are.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Melvin. I really, really enjoyed sitting listening to that. And I know that the many Christians who are sitting listening to that would have enjoyed that as well. Now, the first question I'm going to ask in response to that, I'm going to give you a minute or two to think about it while I do my Irish waffling on. But basically, I want to know really, why is it so hard to get people to go to the logical conclusion of their worldview? Because as I listen to you, that word you said, consistency and coherence, like what you're describing there's a consistency, there's a way of that makes sense, it stands. And when you said about the sugar, that's what I was thinking, because when I came to Hull to do my teacher training, I lived with a guy he was an atheist, but he was always asking me questions, and he kept saying, yeah, but it's okay for you, Peter, because now that you believe, you can't see it. Your mind's closed, and there's an element of truth where I've tasted the sugar and it is sweet. And so it is quite hard to put myself back in his position. But why is it just so, it seems to me, even my friends now are not Christians, why is it so hard to get them to go to the kind of logical conclusion of what they think? That damn bad luck thing you said about people dying, it's just not an okay answer to give. It's quite an offensive answer to give, even, it's just bad luck. But why is it so hard to get so many people to go there? Melvin?
Well, there are a number of reasons, really. The first thing, I mean, when I was a young Christian, I came here to university as a student, and I was just so full of this new faith. To me, it was, in those days we had black and white television, and color television had just come in. So it was just like actually moving from black and white television to color television. That was my experience of life suddenly. And I just wanted everybody else to know that. So I thought this is going to be simple. I've got all the arguments. I'm just going to be able to argue with people and convince them to become Christians. I soon discovered it wasn't that simple. And again, just thinking back to my own experience, it's not just a matter of reason, because we're often not creatures just driven by reason. We like to think of ourselves as reasonable and critical and intellectual people. We're not, by and large. We're driven by our emotions often, and what we like and what we dislike. And deep down in all of us, we dislike being told things about ourselves which are perhaps not terribly flattering. And we also feel sometimes we don't want constraints. We don't want to. And some people therefore look at Christianity as constraining. And therefore, as one writer, G.K. Chesterton, once said, it's not so much that Christianity has been tried and found wanting. People have analyzed it and it's fallen apart. It's been found demanding and therefore not tried. And sometimes it's like that. It's not that there aren't good reasons. There are brilliant reasons, but we need more. Sometimes it's not just the reason that's needed. It's a change of heart and attitude and humility. And sometimes it's a willful blindness we have. We just don't want it to be true. We don't want it to be true. I mentioned did I mention C.S. Lewis? I think probably at one point. I mean, he's a good example, really, because he was brought up in Belfast, so he had a sort of Christian background, but then rejected that. I was very cruel to his father, I think, in that rejection when he went to Oxford University, and full of arrogance as he was, and then he went into the First World War as a lieutenant, got wounded, and so on. And for many years, with his great intellect, he argued against the Christian faith. And there were some very other clever people he met at Oxford, like Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, who were Christians, and he couldn't understand these clever people being Christians. And his testimony goes basically that for a long time he just fought against it, and he eventually described himself as the most reluctant convert in the whole of Christendom. It's not that he didn't have reasons. He didn't want it to be true, because it meant that there was someone above him, and he didn't like that. So sometimes pride is a problem.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. I've got a few questions that I want to ask you now, which I guess the framework that you've put together for us tonight will be very helpful as you answer, but some of them relate to the last event as well. But I'll put them to you and then hear what you have to say, and we'll get as far through these questions as we can, but we'll definitely be finished at 9. That was a promise, and even though there's an Irishman with an Irish accent, I will stick to time, okay? So here's, in the last event we said that sin is what has broken the world, but at the same time God is all powerful. He's still in control. So a question that Martin came back with from some of the people he had been talking to was, who really is responsible for COVID then? That's quite a stark question, but who really is responsible for COVID? What would you like to say to that?
Well, it's like, I mean, why with COVID? I mean, why not say who's responsible for the mold growing up the wall here, or was responsible for flu or whatever? But I guess behind that is this sort of implication that whoever made the world, he is ultimately responsible, and in one sense, that's true. But when you start talking about responsibility, it's a wee bit more complicated. So, for example, a lot of car accidents and people die through car accidents. Who's responsible for the car accidents? Is it the maker, the inventor of the internal combustion engine? Well, in one sense, yes, because had you not invented it, there wouldn't have been cars, there would be no accidents. Okay. But that's a bit removed. It's much more that the people who are driving like maniacs, for example, are responsible for car accidents. And it's like that in this world. So I think whether you're talking about disease, viruses and the like, in one sense you can say, yes, God as the creator and the one who made everything is responsible, but not in the sense that he got it wrong, but really that he set up the world in such a way that if one went against it, there would be consequences. And one of those consequences of our rebellion is a whole host of bad things, that the world doesn't operate as it would have done and will do when Christ returns. And all of these things, COVID and many of the bad things, are in part there to remind us that all is not well between ourselves and our Creator. They are painful reminders sometimes. The question is, what do we do with those reminders? Like COVID, do we just say, damn bad luck, it's just bad luck? In which case, there's nothing to argue. Or is it going to cause us to think, hang on, should it really be like this? Why is it like this? And what's my responsibility to my Creator for the way things are turning out? See what I mean?
Yeah. It's interesting. That's kind of what we got to at the end of the last one as well, was that, look, you could give a lot of reasons why this might be here. But actually the thing that is most urgent is how we respond to this God. And when people begin to get that and they begin to think maybe there is a response demanded, sometimes the questions can then start to come. And I don't know if the questions are there to try to, again, like keep God at a distance or whatever. But I think when you begin to get that you should be responding to a God, well, then there are other barriers that go up.
Yeah, well, the other thing I think I want to say is, well, let's have a look at how God does respond. And you look again to Jesus. Now, what does he do? Now, well, when people come to him with diseases equivalent to this, he heals them. Yeah. Because these things are destructive in his Father's good creation. Yeah. And that's what he's come to combat and to deal with. So it's not that. So at the very least, one of the things that you can offset on this, who's responsible, you can't say, well, God doesn't care, or God's totally out of control. No, God cares enough to come into the world and get his hands dirty and get his hands pierced eventually, to do things about it. So that's what you see with him. The Christian God is very different to any other. It's not like Allah, who certainly is distant, or the Eastern religions where there are many gods and or Greek gods who really don't care much at all.
Well, that's good. That actually leads nicely on to this next question. So you've spent like most of your life, I guess, now you're a young man, obviously, but you've spent most of your life teaching the Bible to people. And so I guess there's loads of things you'd want to say in response to this, but why do you think the Bible is different from any other holy book? So let's start with that. Why is it different?
Well, again, there's lots of reasons you can give to that. I think I mean, one reason I'll give, I've already touched on it in terms of it being a good map. It's got great, what you in science, as you say, has great explanatory value. It has power to explain things, why we feel we're significant, why the world is in a mess. And at the central character of it all is the Lord Jesus Christ. How do you explain this man? He's not like anybody else. He said he towers above everyone else, and yet there's a humility about him too. He's accessible, and yet he has, for this Galilean carpenter, and yet he has tremendous authority, and seems to be able, he can still waves and he can raise the dead. I mean, who is this man? And it was only 30 years old, and the Bible itself gives its own explanation, and so that makes sense. It sort of is it's got its own sort of compelling explanatory force, if I can put it like that. So that's at one level, and another level would be to say that I don't think there's any book in human history that's been subject to so much scrutiny and criticism by thousands upon thousands of scholars and different people throughout centuries and throughout the world, and yet it's still the world's bestseller. It's still intact. It's still reliable. It's not been taken apart. That's pretty impressive. That's a pretty good track record. Yeah. But the third thing is that it's life-changing. In a way, for the good, shall I put it that way? Because I mean, Mein Kampf was life-changing for the Nazis, but I mean, it's not great. But this is life-changing for the good. I mean, you just see this. You just see people who were in a complete mess. And by coming to this book, they discover the God of the book. They encounter the person of Jesus Christ, and their lives are transformed. So someone said that if you read the Bible like any other book, you soon discover that it is not like any other book. So you do read it like any other book. You begin, you read it in words and sentences and the context and everything else. You don't try to look for hidden meanings in between the text. You take it at its face value, but you also see it within its broader context, its broader story of creation, of things going wrong, of God working through particular people and a particular group of people until eventually you come to this very special person of Jesus Christ. And that's when the whole world is literally turned around. How do you explain it?
What would you, I mean, this is more, maybe more of a pastoral rather than an apologetic question, but people often want to read the Bible or start reading the Bible. What advice would you say to go about doing that?
Well, what you mean, like for the first time?
Well, or there'll be Christians here even tonight as well that are thinking, I know that I should be reading the Bible, but what would you say to us about how to go about doing it?
Well, if one's, say, if you're not a Christian or you're a young Christian, the important thing is getting to grips with the person of Jesus, because that's who the main characters have said. So it's good to read the gospel. As I said, I started with Matthew's gospel because I just thought, well, that's the first one. So that's a good one to start with. That's no problem. If you haven't got much time on your hands and you want something a bit more punchy and dynamic, Mark's gospel's pretty good. It's short. He did this and he did that, and it's very full of action. Lone Ranger stuff. Who was that masked man? It's good. If you want something a bit more sort of contemplative, if you're that kind of person, and you like to mull things over, John's gospel's fantastic. If you got more of a sort of analytical medical mind, Luke's gospel is good. But they're all different biographies of the same person from different perspectives, written in slightly different styles, because they were written by different people, for instance. So definitely, and if you're a Christian, read a gospel at least once a year. Don't neglect reading the Gospels. But as you go on as a Christian, it's important to not to be to try and get to vary your diet like anything. If you're eating egg and chips all the time, it's not good for you. So vary your diet. And so it's good to read some stuff from the Old Testament narrative. Read it as a story. The Psalms, wonderful book in order to enable us to, well, realize that other people experience what we experience. And it's a vehicle for us not only praising God, but praying to God and sometimes putting into words our feelings,
Yeah.
The epistles, the books that come right at the end of the Bible, written by Jesus' followers, which explains a little bit more about the significance of Jesus, but also what it means to live a Christian life.
Yeah.
Keep it varied, but don't neglect. Each day, try and put a little bit of time aside and work through it.
Yeah. No, that's good. Thank you. And I think I would add, just as, at Riverside Church, Mark's Gospel is what we're going through at the minute, but I want some of the people we are the most concerned for. We would say, come along to church, come and sit and listen to God's word. Come and you don't have to be feeling that you're at the end point of your journey, that you're a signed up Christian, to be able to sit in church and listen to God's word and be helped by other people.
Absolutely.
As well.
Yeah, and that's right. It's not that's important, because in fact it's not just a private enterprise. It's not an individualistic enterprise. But we're used to reading our own books. But when they were originally written, certainly they were read out in groups in churches, because they didn't have books like we had. They didn't have printing presses, so manuscripts were very, very rare and very, very precious. So you didn't have that many, and so it was a communal event. But also you had people who explained it as you went along. And you see Jesus doing this. He goes into the synagogue, he reads a bit of Isaiah, then he explains it. And God has gifted different people with the ability to explain the Bible and go deeper. That's a very precious thing to do. So yeah, absolutely. Don't try just by yourself. Get to a group of people who know the Bible better than you do. Yeah. And they'll help you.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to finish with this last question, because what we're hoping is that, I think what we're seeing as well is that some of the people that are around the outskirts of Riverside Church, I think they do begin to get that there is a response demanded. Whenever there's a God who's there is some sort of response demanded. And yes, the Bible, like getting into the Bible and reading that and maybe coming to church would be a good thing to do. But there's that kind of last ditch attempt to sort of say it's all nonsense. And this question maybe covers a few of those things. Like, with modern scientific advances, can Christians really believe that Jesus physically rose from the dead? If you really do, if like C.S. Lewis, you're a reluctant convert, but maybe this is the question that will save you and stop you coming to accept it. So what would you say to that one?
Well, science, I can't see, to be honest, what relevance that has, what modern advances in science has to the question of whether Jesus rose from the dead or not. Because science, okay, just simplistic way here putting it, but science is concerned with examining and trying to explain regular occurrences and to codify those, produce laws and so on, like Newton's laws of physics and things like that. So that you're looking at, if you like, ordinary events, and you try, and there are limits to science, there are limits to science, but it's also incredibly productive. We wouldn't be able to do what we're doing tonight if it weren't for science and technology. It's brilliant. But science can't explain everything. Because it just some things fall outside the scope of science and its technique and its methodology. So science can't explain love or beauty or art, because that's not what science is designed for. Science is brilliant at doing what it's meant to do, and to explain, regular events. Now, something like the resurrection, by definition, or miracles, by definition, are not regular events. That's what makes them miracles. They're unusual events. Now, it doesn't mean that they're just freaky events, sort of haphazard events. They're meaningful events. So the thing is this, that both creation, or those things which science observes, and miracles, both of these things are expressions of God at work. In science, we got it because God is an orderly God and a caring God and a rational God. We live in a rational, orderly universe. That's why you can do science. That what happens today, you put the kettle on, water boils at 100 degrees centigrade today, it will do so tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that and so on at a particular pressure. That's what makes science possible, because that's the way God set things up. It's not random in a weird, chaotic way. And all of this is an expression of God, of God's activity in the world. So there's a purpose there to make the world and universe work well. But then, so you come to these things called miracles. Now, again, these aren't just weird, freaky things that happen for no purpose. They also are expressions of God's purpose and kindness. So we're not talking about, when you look at, say, what Jesus does, we're not talking about sort of weirdy Uri Geller things of bending spoons, which is a trick anyway, but they're just there to entertain you. We're talking about someone who's lost the son and she's weeping, she's a widow, she can't cope without him. And Jesus raises him from the dead. Now that's a sign of God's kindness, but it's also a sign of God's purpose, that this is the kind of God he is. It's a God who gives life and who expresses love and wants us to love him back. And so with the resurrection of Jesus, Peter in the book of Acts in his 7 said, it was necessary that he was raised from the dead. In that his life and the story of the Bible wouldn't have made sense had it been left like that. It's like watching a film when sometimes there's some films where I just, come on, where's the ending? It shouldn't have ended like this. You feel let down and disappointed. And there are some films where suddenly there's a sort of twist, and I thought, where did that come from? That doesn't make sense. Miracles aren't like that. Miracles make sense of the story of the Bible, of the world, and of Jesus. So both creation, what science observes, is simply observing what God is doing. Someone described it, I'm trying to remember which one it was, it may have been Maxwell, with science is thinking God's thoughts after him. Miracles are special, supernatural, we use the term, events by God, which can't be analyzed scientifically because they're not the usual events. But it doesn't mean they're absurd, and it doesn't mean that they're fairy stories either.
Thank you very much, Melvin. I'm really appreciative. We've made you work very hard tonight, but I'm very appreciative because the thing about all of these questions, they're not answered in a vacuum. These are questions that are a matter. They're a matter of life and death, aren't they? The answers to these questions are the answers that we need in the hardest times in life. And I know you have dealt, just with many grieving people, and being part of a big church and a loving church, you're constantly trying to give answers to people who are struggling. And so I'm just so appreciative that you've joined us tonight, because none of those answers are kind of these big philosophical answers of sitting on a seat somewhere and pondering. They're answers that come from the heart of a pastor who is answering these questions to people all the time. And so thank you so much for being with us tonight. And I'm sure we'll hear more from you when we do more of these events and so on. But really appreciate it. And what I would just want to finish with really is to say thank you for joining us, everybody else, over these last couple of events that we've done. Thank you for being part of them. And these answers are not there from a vacuum. They're there, and they answer our real life questions, and they can bring us delight and joy when we realize that Jesus Christ is exactly who he says he is. So what are the next steps? Well, you could watch the events again because they'll be on YouTube. You could ask your Christian friends some questions. You could send me an email and maybe even want to meet up with me and talk to me. And don't worry, I'll not come too close to you, but I'll keep my social distance and we can have a conversation. Or maybe you could join us on Sunday for our church services. We're doing them on Zoom at the minute at Riverside. They're on at 11 a.m. And then you could watch out for more events like this in the future. So I guess all I would like to leave you again with is that idea of response. I would want to say respond to these things, respond quickly to them, respond urgently to them. They're true. They bring joy, they bring peace, and they bring an eternal security that is what we're actually longing for. So thank you very much. And we'll not hang around afterwards. We'll just stay, we'll stop the event there. But please do get in contact if there's things that have come up that have really touched you tonight. Thank you. Thank you, Melvin.